Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Engaging Employees for 2025. My name is Anne-Marie Sapuca, and I'm the Managing Director for the Houston region for Strategic Retirement Partners. And we really appreciate you joining us today, which actually happens to be our first event of our 2025 Plan Sponsor Fiduciary Trainers and Education Series. So just a few quick notes before we get started. All lines will be muted, but we really do welcome and encourage your questions. We really want this to be engaging. So if you have one, please get out your phone and fire on the QR code that you're going to see pretty much on every presentation slide. That will take you to an online form where you can go ahead and submit your questions. I'll monitor the questions and then we'll try to get to as many of them as possible with our time together today. This session is recorded, and we're going to go ahead and share the recording with all who registered later in the week. Attendees can also earn 1 hour of SHRM and PSCA CE credit, which we will also include when we share the recording with you. I am so excited today to introduce our speaker and my co-host, Bonnie Trikel. She is the Chief Solutions Officer and actually the founder of Endeavor Retirement. So Endeavor Retirement is a consulting firm that's dedicated to solving problems for plan sponsors and employers like yourselves, advisors like me, and service providers in the retirement plan industry. She is also a partner at Endeavor Law, and that's a firm that's dedicated to supporting the ecosystem of financial services with their retirement plan related decisions, documentation, compliance, and regulation. But really, most importantly, she's a friend of SRP and a strategic partner, and I can't tell you how excited I am to be here and presenting with her today. So Bonnie, I am turning this over to you, and I can't believe we're actually doing this. This is excellent.
Well, thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for having me. And thanks everyone for spending the time to join us today. As Anne-Marie mentioned, we are on a webcast, but this is meant to be interactive and to answer all the questions that you've brought with you today. So it's not just for CE purposes, but it's really just to make sure that you're able to get both your questions answered about some of the legal requirements, but also to really think about, like, we're here in this new year. And that's why I love the topic that SRP decided to present today, which is really employee engagement. Like, what a great opportunity to hear from Anne-Marie as an expert to think about how can you set the tone for your employee engagement plan throughout the year. So again, I'm excited to be able to co-present with Anne-Marie. I can't remember where I was, where Anne-Marie, I think it was maybe at your conference where we had the opportunity to meet. And it was really, it struck me as you are someone who is not only a person who's very detail oriented, a consultant, as mentioned, out of the Texas office, but also, like, I think it's really, really well said on, your bio, where it talks about, like, you wake up every morning because you want to make an impact, and you go to bed every night knowing that you can really make a difference. And that really is why I think you're the perfect person to be co-presenting today, and really talking about employee engagement, because that's really what it's all about, is how can you make a difference and make that impact for your employees. So again, really excited to have Anne-Marie, who is a managing director leading that Houston office with the team, and excited to be able to co-present with you here today. So what are we going to talk about today? Beyond just the basics of engaging employees, what we're here to talk about today is to spend some time talking about those critical topics for plan sponsors. And I'm actually going to back up. I'll kind of go over what we're going to talk about, but I want to leave up this QR code so that people can make sure they have an opportunity to be getting out their phones and being able to get to that spot to answer, have their questions answered. So what we're going to hit on today is, number one, thinking about those required notices, and then talking about going beyond required notices for your employees and thinking a bit more about that communication strategy. Part of that's going to be talking about 404C and 404C compliance, which for some of you, I'm guessing you don't even really think about 404C that much anymore. And we'll talk a little bit about why, but why it's still important. We'll go beyond that and talk about how you go beyond those required notices and think more about things like, What do you think about that overall communication plan and communication strategy? And that's where Anne Marie is going to help you think about mapping that out for the year and also help you think about how do you actually put that into action and think about a case study so that it's like, hey, this stuff actually works. These people aren't just talking in theory, but this stuff actually works. And then we'll also spend some time, again, back to probably more of those boring things that you don't want to focus on, but you have to, like missing participants and what your duty is to keep track of your people, even when you might feel like, hey, isn't that their job, not mine? So we'll round it out with some action items and make sure we take your questions both along the way and at the end. So that's what we have in store for you here today. Again, please submit the questions using that QR code. And if you have any trouble, again, I think Anne Marie's monitoring that as we go. Anne Marie, did I miss anything before we really jump into more of the substance?
No, I think you summarized it really well.
Awesome. Well, with that, I'm going to touch on just a couple of high level concepts and then we'll get going here. But, why is employee engagement? Why is this an important topic? Beyond what I already mentioned, why are we talking about this here today? Number one, we want to talk about this to really help our employees save more and have a better preparation for retirement so that we don't have people at the end of their careers unable to retire. Because one of the things we know is that that actually has a financial impact to us, right? If we have folks who aren't saving enough and aren't able to actually retire, that has a financial impact on our organizations. Number two, we also want to think about this from the perspective of ensuring that all eligible employees that they can participate equitably. And we'll talk a little bit more about that again, probably in some of that more boring compliance side of things when we think about it from the perspective of what I'm going to say Secure 2.0 and the changes to eligibility requirements for people putting their own money into the plan, but also just thinking about that from the perspective of how you could strategically design your plan from an eligibility perspective. And then finally, again, more back to this, like, how do you think about your plan overall from a plan design perspective when you think about increasing participation and contribution rates? Really, this goes to something that is probably, I'm going to make a quick reminder here. Most of you on the line are probably wearing a fiduciary hat. One term that if you've been on any of the other presentations that we've done from last year, you probably remember talking about this concept of settler function. Or really, we could take the fancy out of it and just call it business function, right? Some of you probably wear both a fiduciary hat and a business hat. Some of the concepts we're going to talk about today, they really are going to touch on more of what I'm going to call this like 50,000 foot decision-making process, which is your business hat or your settler hat. It really is hey, why do we have our plan? What are we trying to accomplish for our people? And again, Anne Marie's going to talk you through some of this. I'm going to talk about more of the boring stuff like, hey, with your fiduciary hat on, you've got to make sure those notices get out. You've got to make sure that you're 404C compliant because your document says that that's what you're going to do. But I think Anne Marie's going to share some of the things like, hey, if you really want to help your people retire, with dignity and do X, Y, and Z, to do that, that's a business decision because it's going to maybe cost the business money. It actually might save the business money, but that's where I want you to just think about what hat you're wearing when, because those are different hats and those carry, again, different liability, different responsibility, etc. So that's why that's important, just to keep that in mind as you think about what hat you're wearing and how that goes. So maybe I'll pause there and actually, Anne Marie, turn it over to you to really bring this to life a bit more about like, hey, what does this actually look like in real life?
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'll go ahead and date myself and just tell you that I have been doing this for quite some time. So some of these examples, I have lived and breathed them, and I know that they work. So I just thought it would be a good way to start out with a success story of engagement with employees that I've seen happen time and time again with the clients that we work with. What I think is important here is twofold. One is that it's really thought out with purpose. Why are we doing this? Then how are we going to do it? And then more importantly, how do we measure what we did? Because we don't want to keep repeating things if we don't have success with it, and we need to measure to have success. And then the other thing that I said that is, I think, extremely important is that it's a repeatable process. Because the success of this engagement in this example I think is really because we've repeated this process year after year after year. So, just at a high level, what the employer wanted was a couple things. One, to increase employee understanding of the 401k plan, which is what everyone wants. But this was because the employee had just acquired a new employer had just acquired a new company, and they had also hired a lot of employees. So they wanted to make sure that at least the new people understood the 401k plan. Two, always wanting to boost deferral rates. The other objective was to go ahead and really encourage employees to take a look at their investments and make a conscious decision of the investment that they're in and whether they would keep it or swap it out. And then the other really pointed goal was to make sure or try to get more beneficiaries designated to the plan because we saw a gap there. So what did we do? It was very, very simple and did not include a lot of heavy lifting from you as the employer. We ran a campaign twice a year. And it was really during the time that we thought might be a good time for employees to be reviewing their 401k account kind of towards the end of the year, maybe the middle of the year, but more importantly, when employees were available, right? There's busy times when employees cannot be getting on calls and one-on-one meetings, but we really try to tailor it when they were available. And then the meeting format was a 15 to 20-minute meeting, one-on-one virtually with me, my team. And then it was promoted via email with a link directly to my calendar. So none of these sign up lists and things like that. An employee could click on the link and directly get to my calendar and sign up for a time. So it made it very easy. And what happened? Yes, we saw an increase in deferrals. As a matter of fact, people were deferring to get at least to the match. So to me, that's very successful. I'm spending employer money, right? Because now there's going to be a lot more spent on match, but that was the goal. Let's get them enrolled and up to the match. We actually got 7 more people to designate beneficiaries. And then what we did is we went ahead and we pulled the employees that actually participated. 85% of them said, hey, I am really confident or more confident in understanding this plan. And every one of them expressed satisfaction in that they got to speak with someone. Um, a lot of employees, a real lot of employees don't have access to an advisor on a daily basis or even outside of the plan. So this gave them the opportunity to express and ask questions about the plan. And then on the long term, what we decided doing is we actually now offer a certified financial planner for these meetings. So those employees that I've been talking to for quite a long time, year after year, now have further questions about finances that we want to make sure are answered. And we actually have a CFP now that meets with them during the same time that I'm meeting with other employees. So this is really simple, but it shows an incredible success rate. And like Bonnie said in the beginning, when your employees are happy and on their way to what we look at as a successful retirement, that costs you less as an employer. And that's the real goal of having the plan, is to make sure that we're trying to set them up for financial freedom. So with that, Bonnie, I'll turn it back over to you.
I love a couple of things of what you said there, because one of the things you said is it's simple, but it's like it is simple, but it's repeatable. And so
Mhm.
that can bring real success to it. And the simplicity, and we'll talk about this in a couple different things, even related to notices, but the simplicity is what makes it repeatable. And then also it's like the power of people and the access to an advisor, because it is so many folks like, I think about like my parents, right? They never had access to an advisor outside of
Mhm.
their workplace plan. It's just many people will never have that access. And that's the power that that brings to someone to be able to have that access. So that's really cool. And, getting to the boring part of things, I'm going to talk about notices next. And some of you are probably like, hey, how does notices or required notices fit with this same topic? But we put these together because, if you can start to blend in things like getting your notices right and getting those to be simplified and repeatable, then you can spend more time focusing on things like what Anne-Marie's talking about. So that's one of the reasons we put these presentations together. They're all in the like your people category, right? And it's everything from the basic notices that have to go out the door. And if you can get that right and simplify it in your process, then you can really spend more time working with Anne Marie on these things that really can like drive results for your people. So, what do you really have to know in this presentation? There's a couple of key things we want to make sure you take away. And then some of these things you can really do a follow-up and dig in a little bit more later on, like, oh, I didn't get that note on 404A5 and the things that have to be included. You can do your follow-on, but we want to just make sure we touch on them. So a couple of the key concepts we want to make sure that you're taking away today. And then again, we'll dig in a little bit more detail. Number one, I think it's important to strike the right balance, as I was just mentioning a moment ago, between like your regulatory requirements and what you are, forced to do, and then the employee engagement piece. So don't spend all your time on notices, but don't spend all your time on the employee engagement strategy and forget about those required notices. Not doing the required notices have a per day penalty in some cases. So you don't want to get stuck in that space. So make sure you strike that right balance. The next thing is making sure you don't forget about things like 404C compliance. Again, it's easy to skip over those because oftentimes you're actually outsourcing most of these things. But again, it's just doing those quick check-ins to say like, wait, who's got this? And making sure you understand who's taking on which responsibility. And that includes things like 404C, but it also extends to these things like missing participants. And one thing, I'll probably use this term missing participants a few times during the presentation. I should clarify, we get in our retirement plan space and we forget, what is a missing participant? To clarify, a missing participant is this idea of an individual who had a balance in the plan. They have terminated and they are no longer a part of your plan, but they've left their balance with you and you can no longer locate them. So for some reason, maybe you've been sending out notices to them and you're getting those returned. Or maybe they were a small sum and you tried to do a cash out of their check and that check came back to you. In those types of instances, that's where we're saying that is a quote, like missing participant. So you've got their money and you can't find them. And unfortunately, they're missing because you're still responsible as the plan sponsor for these individuals. So definitely, Anne Marie, feel free to add any clarifications there if we think we need to further clarify who a missing participant is.
No, I think that you hit it on the head with the definition for sure. And I think there's best practices that can be implemented in trying to locate missing persons or participants, I should say. And my I think clue or hint would be really leverage the record keepers for this too. And I'll like kind of stop there, but they can really help with searches and trying to find missing participants for you.
Absolutely. And I think Anne Marie points out a really good key thing that we'll touch on in many of these items is leverage your service providers. One
Mhm.
of the slides we don't have in this presentation, but you'll find in many of the other materials that the firm puts out is that, you are not responsible for doing it all. In fact, you
Mhm.
can hire people to do things for you where you don't have the expertise or you don't have the bandwidth internally.
Mhm.
You are not only allowed to, but you're required to ensure that you're meeting all those obligations under the plan. So with that, I think we'll move on to talking about, required notices. Now, 2 points I'll make before we talk about required notices are number one, there are required notices, and then there's other notices and communications that you'd probably be well served to send out to your people. And what I mean by that is, I'll give an example. When we think about this concept of re-enrollment, there's the idea that you can re-enroll your participants into a QDIA, or rather a default investment option. And for that, there's really only like one notice that you're legally required to send out, which is this standard legal notice. But when I think of a best practice notice, I would definitely encourage sending more than one notice to people to say, hey, here's this legally required QDIA, or rather default notice. So there are required notices and best practice notices. We're going to go over the baseline notices you're required to do right now. And then I would say always think about where can we supplement that with things that put it into plain English, not a lot
Mhm.
of these are required to be in plain English. I'm a lawyer and I've drafted some of these. They are not in plain English. I will be so clear. So you can always supplement with your own things on top of them that make them much more understandable for your people. The other thing I would say, and we already talked about this a little bit, my kind of second tip or point before we jump in, would just be to make sure you understand two things. One, who is preparing these notices, and two, who is sending these notices. And I
Mhm.
actually lied because I'm going to add a third thing. Number three, how are they sending these notices?
Mhm.
So it's who's preparing, who's sending, and how is it being sent? And when I say how, I mean like electronically or via mail, and making sure that if it is electronic, that those electronic requirements have been met per the guidance for how to do that, and that everyone's actually signed off on it. Now we could do a whole nother piece on that, which is really beyond the scope today. But this is where most of these notices, they are the requirement of you on the line as the plan sponsor or plan fiduciary. That being said, in most instances, you're not the one who is drafting, for example, a summary plan description or a 404A5. However, you legally are required to, you've just outsourced that duty.
Mhm.
So, with those kind of disclaimers or tips to get started, I'll jump in with a couple of the notices. So, the first one would be the notification upon eligibility to join the plan. So usually there's going to be this packet that you're going to send out that says, hey, you're eligible to join the plan. It will include the summary plan description because you're required to get that up front. And then it's going to have your salary deferral election, your beneficiary designation form, and all of those things in your initial packet. Another thing that I would note there is that probably the things to think about are number one, are you doing that or is your record keeper doing
Mhm.
that? I'm going to guess in a lot of instances, your record keeper is going to be doing that for you. If that is the case, making sure that you have a good process down. I usually see this if I'm putting out red flags, it would be, and Amory, welcome your thoughts here. Usually, if there's automatic enrollment, I see that
Mhm.
that's where things get off track sometimes, is the timing of that packet in conjunction with some sort of automatic enrollment. Sometimes that's where things get off track. Um, I see a nod.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And I also see sometimes there's a disconnect between, say, getting employees into the system. So the record keeper is notified that somebody is a new hire and needs to send out the enrollment kit. So I would just make sure to, on occasion audit that practice to make sure that there's still communication back to the record keeper so that they can take care of that requirement to get the enrollment kits out. Because, I would hope that most of you on the call are relying on the record keeper to do that this day and age.
Yeah, you bring up such a good point of like basically what is your cadence for an internal audit on this
Hmm.
process to make sure
Yeah.
it's working well.
Yep.
So I think that's a great point. One, rely on your record keeper where you can because that should be done. Two, make sure you're doing some sort of internal audit. Three, I occasionally run into cases where this is still a paper process, but
Hmm.
I it's more and more rare. Hopefully, fingers crossed. And
Hmm.
then, thinking about just, what's your system for updating the communication kit when this, so if you have a plan amendment or a plan document change, what are all the communications in kind of that workflow that have to be updated to get that process updated?
Yep.
The next item we have is part of that kit, so to speak, which is your summary plan description. And really, these next two items go together, which is your SPD or summary plan description and your SMM or summary of material modifications. Now, if I'm giving you my own personal opinion, which is not the opinion of SRP or Anne Marie or anyone else, and it's not legal advice, but I really detest the SMM. Um,
Hmm.
and the reason why is just because I feel like it creates confusion. And here's why. So your SPD is produced as, I'm going to guess most of you might have, well, let me take a step back. Oftentimes now, I can't really ever think of an instance. You have attorney drafted documents, and then you have documents that come from probably your record keeper or your third party administrator. And so those are going to be like a base plan document, which is all your definitions, and then your associated adoption agreement, which is a bunch of check boxes. So I can't even think of any clients I work with that are still using attorney drafted documents. It's just pretty rare.
Mhm.
I don't know, Anne Marie, if you have many.
I would agree with that for sure.
So, for the most part, when you get your base plan document plus your adoption agreement, that combined is a plan document. You can't have one without the other. They have to dance together. They're just a package deal. And then when you get those, a SPD is produced, and the SPD is produced based off of those documents. So then when you start creating SMMs, those come from when you have an amendment. Then you get an SMM. Well, what happens is then you're just tacking that on to your SPD, and they're like duct taped together basically.
Mhm.
And so then when I ask someone for an SPD, they forget one SMM and maybe they pull three others, but they forget one. Well, then you just lose track of this complete package. I don't know, Anne Marie, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think it can be done a lot easier, but we'll go back into, kind of when ERISA started, and it was 50 years ago. So, yeah, last year was the 50th anniversary, a birthday of a lot of these ERISA regulations. So I would agree with that. I mean, I think it can be modernized a little bit better to condense it down and just have one notice a year. But I absolutely agree. It's difficult sometimes to keep track of the amendments that you're doing and then make sure they're included where they are required to be included.
Yep. So that's if you are thinking about takeaway items, make sure that if you have a base plan document plus an adoption agreement, anytime you make an amendment, you either need a full SPD again, or alternatively, you've got to get an SMM and keep all of those packages together in one component.
Mhm.
Then when are you required to provide an SPD to your employees or participants? The SPD, anytime you've made a material change, you can be the judge of material, but think pretty most of your major changes or most of your amendments, those are going to be a material change. You know, you pretty much always, I would provide that. So you have to update your SPD within 210 days following. Weird timing, right? So what's that, 7 months? After, so if you make it in July of 2014, then 7 months into 20, July of 2024, then 7 months into 2025 is when you've got to provide that SPD or alternatively an SMM. And so it's always on that rolling basis into that following year. That's when you need to do it. Or alternatively, you have to update your SPD once every 5 years. So when you're doing your restatement cycle, which we're about to come up for again, then you would do your SPD again. And so that is your basically plain English version of your of your plan document written out is what your SPD is. So
Mhm.
one thing to keep in mind in the era of litigation that we're in, you are not required to provide a full plan document to participants unless someone requests it from you. Otherwise, I would only provide the SPD. I would not provide your full plan document unless someone requests it, and then you have to give it to them on a reasonable time frame.
Mhm.
Anything else on those notices?
No, I mean, I would say you're absolutely right. I mean, for me to understand the plan document, like I said, been doing it a long time, so do understand plan documents a lot now, especially the adoption agreement, but an employee will not. And like you said, if they ask, there is a requirement to go ahead and provide it. But I'm not even sure I know of an employee that has ever asked for it. So just the summary plan description, which is just the highlights and what they probably mostly need to know, suffices. And I would also say, trying to remember this 210 days after the end of the plan year, things like that. Just know that if you make changes, what most of my clients do is say, okay, if we've made changes throughout the year, January, February, we're going to get a new one out. We know we have probably till July of the following, but we just want to get this off our plate. It's a new year, and we're just going to go ahead and communicate those changes. So, but you do have, like you said, the 210 days.
And I'm wondering, when your clients are doing that, there's probably another annual document that I'm guessing they do that with,
Oh, yes, good
which
segue.
great segue there. We did not even rehearse it that way. But
Nope, we
so
did
there
not.
is a document that is provided. It's technically an annual requirement, though you have up to 14 months, another one of these quirky little timing things. But to usually, again, once a year you provide this document, and this is what's called your fee disclosure notice. And it is this requirement that once a year, essentially, the plan sponsor has to provide this notice to participants. Now, again, I don't know any plan sponsor that's drafting this document themselves. Most instances, you're getting this from the record keeper, and the record keeper is sending it out to participants. But I think a lot of times then you can package other things with it, or the timing of it, like sending your SPD at the same time. And I don't know if Anne-Marie, if some of your clients are kind of packaging those things and doing an annual set of notices.
They are. They are. It just makes it a lot easier. And a lot of times, again, the when where they can, the record keepers will go ahead and do this for them. But there are times, like this, the SPD, the employer will go ahead and send that out. One thing I did want to say, Bonnie, is we did have a comment that came into the questions section. And the comment was a really nice one that just says, thank you pretty much for the distinction between what we have to do versus what we might want to do, because the latter is a lot of times what we think we have to be doing and we don't. So keeping that distinction going forward is really good. So thank you for sending in that comment.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think there are a lot of nice to haves versus the
Hmm.
baseline, what you're required to have.
Yeah.
But the 404A5 is that participant notice that you must do. That was introduced back in 2010 and finalized in 2012. It requires that you're disclosing all the fees a participant has to pay, which includes the investments, the administration, and the transaction fees, or any other fees that a participant pays. In terms of what else you are actually legally required to do, there's two others I'm going to mention before I talk about the QDIA. One is if you have a discretionary contribution or a discretionary match. This was a newer one that I feel like kind of slipped under the radar for some
Hmm.
people, but the IRS basically tossed this in with the last restatement cycle. And so it's only for those that are fully discretionary matches. There is a new notice requirement for, and like I have some clients that it's actually technically a discretionary match that the plan sponsor is giving, but they're
Hmm.
doing that same match every year.
Hmm.
And so I think that's where that can get a little bit confusing. But I would say, again, check with your record keeper. Most of them have a sample notice, and some of them actually updated plan documents to try to get around that notice requirement and build it into the document. Some of them did not, but that's another one. If you have a discretionary match, I would just double check that.
Hmm.
And then, and I don't know, Amory, if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, and I think with a lot of the employers I work with, they are, like you said, they're stating this match, and it's the same match every year. They're putting it in the employee handbook. They're putting it online. They're actually giving notice, and all of the requirements of the notice they're actually putting into these documents that they're providing anyways. So they're fulfilling this notice requirement. Now, where I see it needs to come into play is you might be an employer that doesn't declare the match right away. You might not know, and every year it changes. So that's when I think it's incredibly important from an administrative or practicality position to say, okay, our employees really do need to understand what the match is, because that might change how they're saving, and it's going to be this, and this is when it was provided. So I think a lot of times you're already fulfilling that requirement just in what you're already communicating on an annual basis anyways. But again, I mean, pretty much any record keeper I'm working with does have a sample of what needs to be included. And again, you might already be doing that in your communications already, so you wouldn't have to duplicate it.
Yeah, that's a really great point on where you're doing it. One other quick one, summary annual report. This just comes within 60 days after your Form 5500 filing. So keep in mind, you're notifying the government via your 5500 and your employees via your SAR or summary annual report. And then that last one is your QDIA or your default that notice, and that's going to spell out what is that selected default option that you've elected to use, either your managed account, your target date fund, that balanced fund, which one are you using? And that's going to be then at the end of the year going into that next calendar year to say, hey, this is our annual notice. You're doing that initially when you select it and then annually thereafter.
We have a lot of acronyms in this industry, don't we?
I
Sorry about
know.
that, but we just live in this acronym type of world. So, and the other thing I would point out is that the fee notices are very important to tell employees what they're paying. The notices are so difficult to understand. They're in a format that is, from Department of Labor guidelines. So that's how they're completed. But I sometimes have a very difficult time trying to figure out exactly what the fees are and say a plan I might be prospecting, to be able to spell out the fees there. It's difficult. So I know we have to provide these notices, but I think the percentage of employees actually reading them is incredibly low. And hopefully we can, you know, rally to try to get these notices a lot clearer because they're difficult to read.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
they still have to be provided.
Absolutely. I do think that's where good education from
Mhm.
some of the employee engagement programs like you talk about and having access to an advisor can be helpful. Um, I'll move on to briefly talk about, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on 404C, but I do think it's important to just have this quick reminder of what is 404C? Why do we talk about it? It actually dates back a long time. I think it was originally issued in the early 90s, and then it
Mhm.
was amended with some of these fee disclosure regulations in 2010. And the whole idea is that we're trying to protect plan sponsors or employers so that when they offer a plan, if a participant decides to make kind of silly choices with their investment elections, we're able to actually protect the plan sponsor so long as the plan sponsor has done certain things, which is this checklist of the 6 items that you see. And so long as, and we kind of break it down, we're not going to tick through every specific thing, but basically we break it down into 3 categories of things that a plan sponsor does. There's investment menu requirements, plan design types of requirements or admin requirements, so to speak, and then disclosure requirements. And a lot of it is more on the disclosure requirement side,
Mhm.
much of which was consumed by that 404A5 annual disclosure that we just chatted about a moment ago. And the idea really is, hey, as long as we have educated our participants and given them enough information to make informed decisions, and as long as there's at least some level of diversification of options available on this investment menu, then the plan sponsor is not going to be responsible for the individual elections of participants so long as the plan sponsor has still made available a set of designated investment alternatives and or that QDIA option, which were prudent selections to put on the menu. Then if the participant has losses, the plan sponsor is not going to be responsible for that. So
Mhm.
if a 95-year-old makes a choice that would not be appropriate for a 95-year-old, then the plan sponsor is not going to be responsible for that. A question yeah, go ahead, Amory.
Yeah, no, and I think a lot of times, or most of the time, employers are checking the box on the 5500 that says, yes, I do follow ERISA Section 404C. Most of the time, we don't know what that means. So the key takeaway, I think, just in practice is that, yes, it gives you a safe harbor. And the safe harbor is for employees who might choose investments that weren't appropriate. They might suffer losses. And you have protection against that. I also think what's very, very funny is that the investment menu requirement, I'm not sure if anybody knows exactly in the regulations what that is, but it's 3 investments. That's it. It hasn't been changed in so many years. It's pretty much a cash type investment, 1 fixed income, and 1 equity. Now, we all know we don't have that anymore. We have menus that are probably pretty much in the 20 plus, maybe 30 plus investment range. But you have to make sure you have those 3. So most of the time you are absolutely complying with 404C. And again, the one maybe area that we spend the most time on in 404C is those disclosure requirements, which is exactly what you're talking about, Bonnie. So I just think it's very funny that the requirement is three investment choices, where I actually go into menus sometimes where there's 60 and I'm trying to actually narrow them down because paralysis can happen within an employee. They don't know how to make choices with 60. So I'm sorry, I'm getting off the track here, but there is a safe harbor. So when you follow 404C, when you're changing out investments, or there could be a down performance in that particular investment, you have protection under this 404C from um, challenges from employees because of it.
And so maybe that's super helpful feedback. And maybe one of the action items for folks is just if you are unsure, despite what your 5,500 box is checked, if you're unsure if you are 404C compliant or not, that might be a good follow-up action item. I don't know, Anne-Marie, if you would want them to check in with, you or one of the teammates, or I also maybe check with your record keeper to see if they're helping with 404C compliance. But I think that's probably one of the bigger action items is like, if you don't know and your 5,500 box is checked, I'd probably check in with one of your service providers.
Absolutely agree. It's not required. You do not have to check the box to be 404C compliant. But if you are checking it, which I would encourage everybody to, because you do want that safe harbor, just make sure you are compliant. That's all. We're happy to help with that for sure.
Absolutely.
Ooh, Secure Act. Here we go.
Well, and one thing, so we've been talking a lot about required things or 404C and the requirements to comply with that. One note I wanted to make before, as we start to talk about more of the optional things, right? And we'll blend a little required and optional here. And I think a helpful perspective is there's lots of optional things you can do to help with employee engagement. And I know, Anne-Marie, you're going to share a couple of things here in a moment on that as well. But there's so many things out there that you're not required to do. But I do want to make the point that it's like once you open the door, then you have to follow through with that. And here's what I mean by that. Things like financial wellness, different managed account programs, having someone who is doing some sort of engagement with your employees. For plan sponsors listening, you don't have to do those things. You don't have to allow those things. But if you do have to make sure that then you prudently select and monitor those programs that you put into place. And so that's the kind of just leave behind I would ask you to think about is like those things that aren't required, just make sure that once you do start to put them into place, you think about all of your fiduciary obligations that then attach to them. And that's not a reason to not do them. In fact, I think that makes them really stronger programs for your people. But it is just keeping in mind those basic things like, can they be paid for properly from plan assets? Did you document your review both initially and on an ongoing basis if they are paid for out of plan assets? And just those types of things, that's what you want to be mindful of when you're putting those programs into place. And then, we just tried to think about a little of the other things that you might want to keep in mind as it relates to, hey, how do you strategically just design your plan based on some of these different things? So Secure Act, for example, long-term part-time employees. I said that right. I always get tongue-tied on that one. But the long-term part-time employees, both under Secure 1.0 and 2.0, change those rules for folks to be able to be eligible if they have now it's down to 2 years and 500 hours or more for 2 consecutive years in a row, then folks are eligible to make their own contributions. Well, given those rule changes, does it make sense to think about your own eligibility and just, hey, should we change our eligibility overall so that we're not concerned with tracking hours and that sort of thing? Yep. And so I think that's one opportunity to just think differently about the plan.
Totally agree with that. Make it as easy as possible. Because if you do have these employees that you hire like that, it gets difficult to track them when they're coming and going. And so all the plans that I oversee that have employees in that category, they just change their eligibility to include them. So they don't have to be tracked, just because it makes it easier. Why not give them the opportunity to save? They might not take you up on it, but why not at least offer it to them. So I think it's a good change. It just makes it difficult sometimes to track. So make it easy on yourself administratively.
Yeah, and I think that goes along with kind of our last point there is like think of things where you can make it easy to coordinate both with like service providers. So when you think about like managing enrollment and those kinds of things, make sure you can offer things that attract talent and have like stair steps for different things and different eligibility, and you can really make things complicated, and that can serve a real benefit, but it can also have a detriment. For example, if your service providers can't implement what you're trying to do either through your payroll provider, your HRIS system, or your record keeper, that will not serve you well if your service providers cannot accommodate that, or if, for example, it's too complicated for you to be able to audit your own systems and really be able to administer it effectively. So really just think about, as you're designing, how can you incent key talent through things like different vesting schedules, different ability through eligibility, and then some of the Secure Act optional provisions as well. Some of the things like the student loan matching provision and other things like that, they will give you opportunities to really engage folks and be able to attract key talent. Um, Amory, anything else we want to touch on here? I may jump around in our slides a bit because I want to make sure we get to some of your components at the end. And then if we have time, circle back to missing participants.
Okay, no, go ahead. I think this is great.
Awesome. So I'm going to bump us ahead. We will come back if we have time to locating missing participants. Otherwise, we'll just do a follow-up session on this soon, and everyone
Oh,
can.
we could do a whole session on this, best practices and how to do it, right?
That's what I was thinking, but I wanted to make sure we had some time for really like putting this program together and bringing it to life.
Got it. So, there was a school of thought when it came to employee education that quite possibly you might want to have an employee education policy, kind of like your investment policy statement, where we know it's not required, but it's really good to have because it details out everything that you're doing in the investments. And should you be challenged, you can show a repeatable process that you're doing. And there was a school of thought with an employee education plan, the same thing. I quite think a little bit opposite on this because the targeted employee education plan tends to change every year. And you might be focusing on a particular year on your retirees or those close to retirement. How are we going to focus on those and bring them programs that they'll benefit from and learn how to say deaccumulate and take out of their plan when they're in retirement versus all of this accumulation that we talk about. So what I think is really important is to try to put an annual education plan together that highlights what you want to do during the year, but is kind of a live document that's going to keep changing as we go through the year. So, how do we do that? The first thing we do is we look at everything that we, meaning SRP, has to offer. And we have a lot. So, we do put out a quarterly participant newsletter. We have quarterly education events, just like this event that we do for you. We have on-demand education. I do, and a lot of the advisors do, customized videos. We have customized enrollment videos, and we have access to a lot of planning tools. So there's a lot there. And then what we do is we take all of that and we look at what your provider also offers, which I'll just say Fidelity, for example, probably has 100 on-demand videos, 100 white papers, all kinds of tools, which can be very, very overwhelming. And so what we do is we look at those and put them together and create a plan for the year. So on the next slide, what you'll see is that there's a plan that we put together. And again, this is an example, but it's by quarter. It is intent on its purpose. And then we actually look by month what we're going to do. Now, twofold. This proves, should you be challenged, that there is an education plan in place. And the other thing is that a lot of times when we're looking at these education plans, when an employee says, well, I wasn't taught that, or I didn't have an opportunity to do that, we can prove it. And the other thing is we all know, we can lead a horse to water, but we can't make them drink, right? So a lot of times these are offered and maybe we don't have participation, but that gives us an opportunity to reevaluate the topic and maybe offer something different. But again, this is coordinating the efforts of the record keeper as well as what we do. And again, it's a repeatable process, but you're going to see targeted communications like in September, it's National 401k Day. So we send out a flyer that can be distributed to employees to do things like check your balance, check your investments, talk to your financial advisor on the plan. So I think having something that's very targeted allows myself as the advisor, as well as, say, the plan coordinator that we're working with at the record keeper, to get together, put our heads together, and then sit down with you as the employer to say, here's what our thoughts are. What do you think? Is it targeting what our goals are for the year? If not, let's change it up. And then at the end of the year, we're able to go ahead and look at what the success was. And you're going to see actually on this, there are the employee meetings that we have one-on-one every about 6 months. So again, this isn't required, but there's so much benefit from it. I really have never had an employee say, wow, this was such a waste of time. I'm really not happy that this happened. Every time an employee is able to talk to someone about the plan and can help them, they are so happy to get any kind of guidance. And like we've reiterated several times during this call, is that employees don't have access to advisors most of the time. So having this, if you have an advisor and they do offer advice in your plan, I would highly recommend that you utilize it. So I see that we're getting close to the end of time. So I wanted to stop there. Bonnie, do you have anything else that you want to add? And I saw one question come through. I'm going to check those real quick.
Awesome. Well, maybe while you're checking that, I will do a very quick hit and run on missing participants and just quickly brief on, we mentioned early on that there is an obligation to keep track of your people. And so one of the things that I'll mention is there was some guidance in 2021 for keeping track of your people. That guidance was super interesting. It came from the Department of Labor and it had some interesting suggestions, but at the heart of it all, and when I say interesting, it was like, hey, contact another employee and ask them where the other employee went. That seemed to be a bit.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Some of the lawyers had some privacy concerns about that, to be clear. But again, the gist and the heart and spirit of it all was you have to keep track of your people. You need to use some reasonable efforts to do so. So the probably more practical thing was work with your record keeper and use one of their kind of locator programs, or on your own, like use a third party locator, but be able to document and demonstrate that you have gone out, tried to locate any of the missing participants and documented the same, and that you've got a routine cadence for doing so. The good news is we did just get some new guidance that came out literally within the last month, and I'm not sure entirely how helpful that was, but I would say, coordinate with Anne-Marie and the team at SRP, and they'll be able to help you kind of look at that guidance and see how helpful it is for your plan. And it's got some additional things for that under $1,000 balance of how you can really work with that. And I would say check that out. So again, I know we're at the top of time. We've got a few action items for you. And with that, we'll also be able to share the information for those who needed CE credit. And I believe we can check that out as well, as Anne-Marie asked maybe a few concluding questions.
Yeah, we actually do and have a question, and it relates to missing participants. Here we go, right? So the question is what's happening with the Department of Labor's lost and found database system, and am I required to communicate with that system the missing participants that might be in my plan?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for those of you who are not aware, Secure 2.0 is something you cannot get away from. So if you are, unless you're leaving the retirement plan space as a plan sponsor, you can't get away from it. And you'll probably see Secure 3.0 drafts coming soon. But what I mean by that is Secure 2.0 had a requirement that the Department of Labor essentially come out with this database where participants would be able to, it's leveraging the Social Security Administration, their information, and that's a way basically to keep track of participants when they're moving from job to job. And so the short answer is, I believe, are you required to take any action as a plan sponsor today? No, in my professional opinion, you are not required to take action. I think it's a kind of, for me, it's a wait and see. It's a, hey, go check it out. I would test it out on yourself. Check out the link, and I'm sure that can be provided as a follow-up, or you can just Google it. But check it out, test it on yourself. It does take a little bit of legwork for the individual to actually go in and log in their information and all of that. Amory, I don't know if you've tried it.
Yeah, and you have to go through the ID Me program.
Yep.
So it's a separate website and you go back in. And so I think, again, in concept, it's a great idea.
Yep.
I agree with you that as an employer, I would wait. And because I think there's still things to work out. I mean, if we think about it, it's sharing of personal information. So, not that you can't share it, but I think there's going to be challenges there. An employee can opt out of the program if they go in. They have an option to do that. I think the concept is great. There's so many employees who, right as now, during this time and age, they are moving employers. They're not staying at an employer for 25 years. So they will have balances that they have to keep track of. So if they go into this type of lost and found system and it really works the way it's intended, it could be really easy to be able to consolidate these accounts. But again, it was a requirement that was enacted that this lost and found database be created. And then now it's in practice. How do we do this? So what I would say is just make sure you have best practices when it comes to missing participants. And what does that mean? It means that make sure your census data is correct. And I have a lot of employers that ask employees on an annual basis to reaffirm their data. Is this your mailing address? When they capture email addresses, they capture personal ones so that they can send emails when an employee leaves to try to find them. And again, what Bonnie said is utilize the record keepers. I have record keepers that I work with that will do a search that you would normally have to pay for. They'll do it for you. And then make sure, maybe like we do with investments, keep track of or document what you're doing. So if there is ever a challenge that you're not doing or upholding your fiduciary responsibility, you can say, here I am, here's my best practices. So I think we could probably spend an entire hour on missing participants. Bonnie, maybe that's the next one we could do at some point. But that was really the one question I had that came through. Bonnie, anything else before I close us out?
No, I appreciate everyone joining today. I know the materials can be made available as a follow-up, so if you missed anything, but thank you so much, Anne-Marie. You're such a great host. I really enjoyed the opportunity, and I think one of the key themes that folks can take away is really that leverage your service providers, but understand what role and responsibility everyone's playing so that you understand what you're still ultimately responsible for as the plan sponsor.
Yeah, and those required notices, there's quite a few of them. So what we try to do is we have a calendar that we have printed out that we give to our clients that just says, hey, here's what's required. A lot of times the record keeper will do that too. Like, here's the whole year and here's what could be required if things change and what notices need to be provided. So with that, like Bonnie, I will say thank you so much for spending your hour with us. We really enjoyed it. I hope you did learn something. And as I said in the beginning, a recording of the webinar will be emailed out later in the week along with the CE credit information. So with that, I will say goodbye and have a great rest of your day.